Iowa, part of the farm belt of the U.S. Midwest, which makes up the breadbasket of America and much of the world. This land is the home of 100,000 farms, whose fertile fields produce 40% of all the corn grown in America. It's also at the forefront of a technological revolution. Farms like Gary Adams' spread outside Fairfield, Iowa, are planted with genetically modified crops, the fruits of the research and development labs of giant U.S. multinational corporations. Like the tractor, GM seeds are viewed by Gary Adam and many U.S. farmers as another technological tool to help them get the most out of their land.
It takes $10 investment in seed to get a $30 return, so that's why farmers are adopting the technology. It pays, and you end up with larger yields, which makes more food for the consumer at less money.
In America, a nation obsessed with food safety, genetically modified organisms are now commonplace, and have up until now slipped into general use with little public opposition. It's been 7 years since the launch of the first GM product in the US. By late 1995, 7 crops had received federal approval from the Food and Drug Administration. Now, more than 20 different types of genetically modified plants are allowed to be grown in America. One of the biggest players in the GM business is Pioneer Hybrid International. William Niebuhr is one of Pioneer's top researchers, leading the company's program to develop genetically modified maize. He's proud of Pioneer's success in the field and the thoroughness of its research and testing. He believes his team has left no leaf unturned in its efforts to ensure the safety of its products.
The plant color's good and the plant health looks great.
Pioneer spends $200 million a year developing new products, and William Niebuhr says they would never take chances with consumer safety.
I believe that these have been tested in a way that I am not concerned about the consumption or the food chain or the food industry with these out there. I believe that we've done such an extraordinary amount of testing up to this point. I also believe that we're continuing that monitoring. We're continuing to test that. We haven't sort of said this is done and we don't have to think about it anymore. We continue to monitor it. We continue to test it. And as a part of the ecosystem that I am, I'm very interested in seeing that going on. But I believe that the benefits of this technology in terms of the reduced insecticide use, the reduced levels of mycotoxins that might exist on a corn grain kernel, the better quality grain that actually goes to the elevator and ultimately ends up in the food system and the animals that eat that, for those reasons I believe that this is a technology that we want to exploit and that we want to make sure that we get the full benefit from.
Do you swear to tell the whole truth?
The Food and Drug Administration is reviewing its regulations on GM products with an eye to possible changes. But only last month, a committee of Congress was being reassured by the FDA.
Mr. Chairman, we are confident that our approach is appropriate. It allows us to ensure the safety of new food products and also to allow the use of safe new biotechnology techniques that give manufacturers the ability to produce better products to provide consumers additional choices.
70% of all the items on the shelves of American supermarkets have some kind of GM content, and US consumers are beginning to take up the concerns over GM food that have swept Europe.
There's no scientific consensus as to whether these foods are okay or not, and yet we're putting them into a food product that's touted as the most highly regulated food product on the market. It's touted as the most safe food product on the market. That's infant formula, something we give to babies from the first day of their lives. And yet they contain ingredients that have never been tested for safety.
With American consumers waking up to the international controversy over GM food, even members of Congress are joining the growing clamor for compulsory labeling. Some products are ahead of the game, already boasting of being GM-free. There are indications that the backlash against GM foods in America is growing, with demonstrations like this in Chicago. John Fagan tests food for GM content and says people have good reason to be worried.
The point is that many of the genes that are being moved into these products are for proteins that have never been part of the human food supply. So we have no history of safe use of these things. And yet the FDA's position is that, well, if there's not a history of dangerous use, then you don't have to worry about it. That's risky, and that's why we're concerned about these things.
This is the world's first GM identification and certification laboratory, set up in Fairfield, Iowa by John Fagan. Samples are sent here from around the world, and Genetic ID now has a list of 800 clients, including several governments. It's a growth industry, as is organic farming, fueled by an ever-increasing demand for the most natural food. But organic farms are threatened by wind-blown pollen from genetically modified crops grown all around them.
The drift thing does bother me. I mean, I don't know how far. This last winter, they said that we might have to have a 300-foot buffer strip. Organic farms, in general, are not that big. 300 feet, if you're surrounded on, like, 2, 3, 4 sides with a field, it could take the whole field.
And unless he can guarantee his fields are uncontaminated by GM crops, he could be ruined.
And that will be devastating because organic doesn't produce as many bushels because we hopefully produce a higher quality, and we get a premium for that. If I get to where I don't grow the yield and I don't get any premium for it at all, you're going to put some organic farmers out of business. I mean, there'll be no choice.
3 generations of Hickenbottoms have been raised on this Iowa farm, which has been organic since 1980. It's sometimes been an uphill struggle, but Stephen Hickenbottom has now built up a solid business. But he must constantly monitor the quality and purity of the organic soya beans and wheat he produces. Just a whiff of contamination by a genetically modified organism, and it could all slip through his fingers, and the Hickenbottoms would be out of the organic business and maybe out of farming altogether. It's not going all the way of the GM camp either, and this winter could see a big downturn in the number of American farmers buying genetically modified seeds. A number of Iowa farmers have already decided to get out of the GM business.
Last year, at that time, the issue wasn't quite as hot as it was this past year, and we did not separate anything, and there wasn't a question at that time as to whether there was going to be a market for either the GMO or the non-GMO, so we didn't feel that it was necessary to do anything different. But now in 1999, of course, the issue is much more involved, and we, from a market standpoint, decided to go all non-GMO this year.
Over the next few months, the farmers of Iowa must decide what they'll plant in their fields next spring. The American Corn Growers Association is already predicting that 25% fewer GM crops will be sown in 2000. But in Iowa, they're still making up their minds.
They're quite concerned and uneasy about what to grow next year. They want to grow, for the most part, GMOs, but if they can't sell it, then they won't. And, you know, they're making their planning, buying their seed, making their planning decisions now, and it's a long time till spring. Those may have to be adjusted, hopefully not. Yeah, it's got the farmer very uneasy.
The American Corn Growers Association is forecasting a mass exodus from GM crops. The association says growing demand for traditional seeds will see GM varieties tumble in price when it comes to harvest time next summer.